thank you all for coming again. Some of you I recognise from sitting in the same seat actually at the Town Hall meeting this morning. But we've got a terrific talk coming up. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people, and that's all 4 of our campuses. And I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past and present. And I'd like to do so particularly on this World Environment Day, because I think it's sort of something that we talk about, but don't, I think, genuinely acknowledge, is that for 60,000 years, Indigenous people in this country lived at one with the environment, and that's an environment that today is under increasing pressure. So I think we need to acknowledge their connections, but also make use of their wisdom in trying to maintain our environment going forward. And critical to that, of course, is political strategy. And that's going to form at least part of what Madeleine's going to talk to us about today. So I'd like to introduce Madeleine, Madeleine Skellern, who's our guest speaker today. She's the Director of the National Health, Sustainability and Climate Unit, and interestingly has some insight into what goes on in the new Centre for Disease Control, which she's also going to talk about. Her background is in economics. She's spent recent years in the United Kingdom, escaped as I have, possibly done more useful things there in reforming parts of the primary care system. But she's here today to talk to us about her personal interests, but also her departmental interests in driving our climate future forward. So, Madeleine, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ken, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. It's a real honour to have been invited. And so the topic of my speech is really, firstly, to introduce to you the National Health and Climate Strategy. That's the piece of work that my team was engaged in over the last year, and we are now in the process of implementing. But secondly, to offer you some thoughts about the role of medical research in the health system response to climate change. And on that second topic, I have to confess to a little bit of performance anxiety, because it feels a little bit like going to Rome, going to the Vatican to give a lecture on Catholic theology to an audience, including the Pope. I, as Ken mentioned, am an economist by background. I've worked in econometrics. That's quite adjacent to epidemiology. I don't claim to have special expertise of any kind on fundamental medical research, and I was really hoping to use this lecture as an information gathering exercise to learn from you what you think the priorities for medical research are in supporting the societal and specifically the health system response to climate change. So I'll offer some thoughts about the kinds of questions that we're always asking in developing climate and health policy within the department and within the CDC, and the kinds of questions that we wish we had answers to, that we think are research adjacent and medical research adjacent. And it'd be great to get your thoughts really on, where you think the gaps are, and whether you think I've got the gaps wrong and there are other things that we should be talking and thinking about. Okay, so Australia's first National Health and Climate Strategy was released last December. It's a whole-of-government plan for addressing the health and wellbeing impacts of climate change, whilst also addressing the contribution of the health system to climate change. So if I had to simplify the strategy in its basis terms, it has 2 pillars. It's tackling those health impacts of climate change, and also thinking about how we can minimise the impact. Well, I normally say minimise the environmental impact of care delivery, but I would expand that here to all the things that happen within the health system, including research. Before I go any further, I just want to firstly echo Ken's acknowledgement of country, acknowledge that we're on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as any Indigenous people who might be with us here today. I also just wanted to acknowledge the fundamental role of health and medical research in establishing climate and health as a field of academic inquiry, and also as a field, a policy area that governments need to take seriously. Australian researchers, such as Tony McMichael, really led the world in establishing this as a climate and health as a discipline. And I just wanted to acknowledge, all of the people in this room who may have come before me in highlighting to decision makers, politicians, governments, as well as kind of research funding bodies, the importance of understanding the multifaceted impacts of climate change on health. Australian climate and health researchers were crucial in making the case to establish the team that I lead, the National Health Sustainability and Climate Unit, but also in making the case to government to develop the National Health and Climate Strategy. And I'll have more to say on this later in the lecture, but health and medical research is going to continue to have a crucial role to play in the years to come because there are still so many evidence gaps, there are still so many things that we don't understand, and we're keen to play as a role as the unit and as my unit and as the department in thinking about how we can support that research and also learn from it. Okay, so the vision of the National Health and Climate Strategy is healthy climate resilient communities and a sustainable, resilient, high quality net zero health system. And the strategy is really organised around 4 overarching objectives, and we kind of commit to actions in pursuit of these 4 objectives. The first is health system. The first 2 are health system focused, and then the final 2 start moving beyond the health system. The first is about health system resilience. That is, building a climate resilient health system that is a system that is able to continue delivering high quality care, no matter what climate extremes may come its way, but also a health system that builds population resilience to the health impacts of climate change. So it's not this pillar is not just about continuity of service delivery, it's also thinking about what we need to be doing within the health system on prevention and on treatment to build population resilience to the impacts of climate change. Secondly, health system decarbonisation, that is building a sustainable, high-quality, net zero health system. I just wanted to dwell on the high-quality bit because we believe that many of the things that are needed in order to decarbonise care delivery also open up opportunities to improve the quality of care, because you need to look at the care models, and when looking at the care models to think about where the emissions are generated and how they need to be reduced, you also have an opportunity to improve how care is delivered. And just to give one example there that I'm very involved in, it's about reducing the emissions associated with asthma inhalers. It turns out that metered-dose asthma inhalers or respiratory inhalers contain very potent greenhouse gases. One of the biggest things that you can do to reduce those emissions is improve adherence to use of preventative inhalers, inhaled corticosteroids and so forth. And so if you can do that, you're improving quality of care, you're improving inhaler technique, so you're improving the efficacy of medicines delivery, but you're also reducing the environmental impact of that care. Our third pillar is international collaboration. That is working internationally within international organisations, but also bilaterally through Australia's aid programs and so forth, to build sustainable, climate-resilient health systems and communities. I'll have more to say on that later. And fourthly, health in all policies. That is supporting healthy, climate-resilient and sustainable communities through whole-of-government action, which recognises the relationship between health and climate outcomes. Again, I'll have more to say on that, but just to emphasise that the scope of our strategy looks beyond the health system, recognising that so many of the key drivers of health that will be affected by climate change sit outside, what's in our gift as healthcare, aged care, so forth. Okay, so I'm just going to got a slide on each objective, and then I'll get into talking about some medical research adjacent thoughts. So really, health system resilience is about, ensuring that the health system is fit for purpose in a changing climate, both continuing to deliver high quality care, but also, as I said, building population health resilience to those impacts. So some of the things that we're committed to doing as part of this action, as part of this objective, are developing a national health adaptation plan, in alignment with the national adaptation plan that's society-wide, that is currently being developed and being led by our Federal Department of Climate Change. And to inform that national health adaptation plan, we've got a huge team focus on engaging with and providing input into the analysis of risks to health and well-being within the National Climate Risk Assessment. So one of the prioritised risks for analysis within the National Climate Risk Assessment is risks to health and well-being. We've had a lot of engagement with that, but worked very closely with colleagues at the BOM, at CSIRO, on thinking about all of the different channels of effect. Heat obviously looms large, heat and heat waves, but also communicable disease impacts, air quality and others, and thinking about on the impacts, not just impacts on physical health, but also impacts on mental health. We're also developing guidance and implementation support tools to enable all different parts of the health system to undertake climate risk assessments and develop health climate adaptation plans. And that's because we think that, sometimes it feels a little bit dry doing climate risk assessment, but actually systematically looking at what the risks to health and what the risks to service delivery are through a kind of risk assessment process really should be the starting point for evidence-based strategic action on how you respond to those risks. We're involved in doing those things at a national level, but actually it's much more important that they occur also at a local level, at a health system level, at a hospital level, because the types of the climate risks that are going to be experienced in Tasmania are very different to the types of risks that will be experienced in far north Queensland. We also think there's a really important role to play in strengthening the role of primary care in emergency preparedness and response in response to climate-related emergencies and extreme weather events. Obviously, emergency preparedness and response already incorporates a huge focus on climate-related hazards. We think that there's a bit of a gap there in strengthening the role of primary care in that response, and we think that primary health networks have an important role to play in coordinating that response in terms of ensuring service continuity, commissioning new services, and connecting up to the wider emergency response structures. And finally, monitoring and surveillance, and this is, might touch on some of the things that some of you are doing in the population health space. Really, we don't have good systems in this country for doing routine data collection, monitoring and reporting on what's happening in relation to climate-related hazards, environmental hazards, and their association with climate-sensitive health outcomes. So some kind of systematic monitoring system that puts those two pieces of data together so that we can know when things are happening. This actually does happen in isolated areas. So there's an excellent thunderstorm asthma monitoring system that's run by the Victorian Government Department of Health. Some jurisdictions have excellent heat wave warning systems that incorporate a health component, but I think there's a lot more that could be done there. Objective 2, health system decarbonisation. So we estimate that the health system in Australia is responsible, either directly or indirectly, for about between 5 and 7% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And we set the goal of achieving a net zero health system encompassing, for those of you who are familiar with the technical jargon, scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. What that basically means is we're not just focused on the emissions that are directly generated in care delivery, things like anaesthetic gas use, kind of natural gas being burnt on site. We're also interested in decarbonising, in thinking about the emissions that are embodied in the goods and services that the health system purchases in order to deliver care to patients. And that's where the bulk of health system related emissions come from. And so that's going to be a huge focus of our decarbonisation efforts. We say that there are 3 pillars to our efforts to decarbonise the health system. The first is prevention, because the best way to reduce the environmental impact of the health system is to ensure that people don't need to use it by keeping them well. And so therefore investment in preventive health is the first thing that you can do to decarbonise the health system. The second is tackling essentially what we call low-value care, or tackling unwarranted variations in the delivery of care. It's estimated that up to 30% of care delivered in Australia is of low or no clinical value, and another 10% is actively harmful. So if you can reduce the amount of low-value care or actively harmful care while continuing to provide high-quality care where it is warranted, you're halfway there, or 40% of the way there. And finally, where care delivery is warranted, delivering it in a way that maintains quality of care, but also does it in a way that reduces the emissions associated with delivery of that care. So the focus here is identifying the key clinical decisions in different medical specialties, for instance, that have major emissions implications, and then working with clinicians, working with the medical colleges to think about how we can develop low-carbon alternatives. Thirdly, international collaboration. This is fundamental to our strategy because climate change is a global problem, so it requires global solutions. There's a lot of learning that we have done through our international engagement. In particular, it's worth mentioning that much of what we include in the National Health and Climate Strategy is inspired by the amazing work that's been done in the United Kingdom and particularly within the English National Health Service. That's been hugely inspirational for our work. Some of the initiatives that we have on the go internationally are joining this thing called the Alliance for Transformative Action on Climate Change and Health. That is a kind of coalition. It's a WHO-sponsored coalition of countries who are committed to action on climate and health, and that's going to be a key vehicle for our international engagement in the coming years, including, we hope, increased engagement with the Asia-Pacific. Secondly, thinking about how we can incorporate health-related commitments into Australia's next nationally determined contribution. For those of you not familiar, that's the kind of policy statement that Australia makes in climate change negotiations about 43% emissions reduction by 2030, net zero by 2050. We're working with our own Department of Climate Change to think about how we can get health-related commitments, both on mitigation and adaptation, into that next statement. Thirdly, we have joined an international coalition led by the English National Health Service and the United States Department of Health and Human Services on designing green procurement standards to support healthcare supply chain decarbonisation. So we're hoping that these standards will be agreed internationally and then picked up and applied domestically. There's a lot of work to do there in terms of securing support for that idea domestically, but we certainly have the support of Commonwealth government ministers for this idea. And this initiative has been developed in the recognition that healthcare supply chains are global. So often, there's something like, New South Wales Health did a survey of their major suppliers, and I think that they found that around 75% of their major suppliers, don't ask me how they define major, are also suppliers to NHS England. So it makes sense that if you're going to tackle these large multinational supply chains, you need to be thinking about international collaboration to align those standards, regulate in an efficient manner and so forth. And a similar point about developing international standards for estimating the environmental impacts of health technology products. So ultimately, in terms of measuring and reducing the emissions associated with care delivery, we need to move from measuring emissions at the organisational level to measuring emissions at the product level, to understanding what the emissions impact of this particular medication, of this particular surgery, of this particular pathology test, of this particular intervention will be. Why? Because that's the information that clinicians tell us they need so that they can deliver low emissions care. There's a bunch of statins on the market which are broadly equivalent for a wide range of patients. And lots of clinicians have said, we'd really like to know what the embodied emissions are in all of those different statins options so that I can just choose the low emissions one, because I know for most of my patients, I could prescribe any one of them. So we think that a key hook for measuring that environmental impact or emissions impact at product level is health technology assessment, asking say pharmaceutical firms to report the embodied emissions when they apply to the PBS for approval or reimbursement decisions. And we've been engaging with our colleagues in the department that oversee those schemes to think about what the options might be there. And as many of you would know, there's a health technology assessment review underway that's nearing completion. And there was an options paper released in January that included recommendations about incorporating consideration of environmental impacts into Australian HTA. I know nothing more than you guys do about whether that will find its way into the final report, but certainly I would really welcome it if it did. Oh, sorry, what's the international angle on this? If you're going to ask pharmaceutical companies or device manufacturers to report the embodied emissions, you need to do it in a way that is internationally consistent. So we are working with a consortium, a collaboration being led by the British Standards Institution to develop new ISO standards for the carbon footprinting of pharmaceuticals in the first instance, but hoping to expand to other health technology products. And ideally, then they would be taken up by the HTA agencies of the world, so that, you know, when GSK has to report the embodied emissions in their pharmaceuticals, they can do it once for the whole world. And that's the least we can, you know, that's the least we can do to kind of, that's efficient regulation, whilst also achieving good environmental outcomes. Final objective is health in all policies. So I mentioned this already. What does health in all policies practically mean? The way that I understand it is it's got two components to it. Firstly, on the adaptation side, it's about recognising that you need to take actions to address the health impacts of climate change that go beyond the health system, that look at health determining sectors, recognise that those wider determinants of health, like air quality, like transport, like urban planning, like housing, the impacts of climate change on health will be mediated by those things. So we need to be building climate resilient housing. We need to be developing sustainable cities, transport systems. We need to be promoting sustainable food and nutrition policies. So a lot of our activity is focused on engaging with other parts of government in those health determining sectors to do some of the things I've listed here, and I won't go through all of them. The second side to this work is the health co-benefits of promoting the health co-benefits of wider emissions reduction. So we know that many of the initiatives that are already underway to help to achieve Australia's net zero commitments will also have significant health benefits. For example, the National Vehicle Efficiency Standard that was recently introduced, we know that will have significant health benefits. Likewise, efforts to promote more sustainable food and nutrition policies, promote more lower emissions foods, that will also have knock-on health benefits. So there's a co-benefit there between reducing emissions and health benefits. And we think that if it's not the health sector, health professionals that are highlighting within government and within policy-making circles the health benefits of wider emissions reduction policies, then no one's going to do it. So we see ourselves as having an important role to play there as well. Okay, so they're the four objectives. Just to segue to kind of medical research, I just wanted to highlight that in addition to those four objectives in the strategy, we develop a few actions under what we call enablers. These are enablers of action, activity in these areas, workforce, research, governance will enable achievement of the four primary objectives in the strategy. So we have an enabler on workforce, basically providing the health workforce with the skills and resources they need to lead the health system response to climate change. Enabler on communication engagement, basically providing patient-facing and clinician-facing materials about the health impacts of climate change, how to respond to them, as well as what the opportunities are to deliver care in a more sustainable, low emissions way. And governance, well, really collaboration, really what we mean by that is that we need to, basically we can't deliver the visions of the strategy on our own. We need to be working across governments, across all levels of government, beyond government, with academic research institutions, NGOs, community organisations, local communities to understand what we need to be doing to respond to the challenges posed by climate change. And our governance and collaboration structures need to reflect and enable that. Finally, research and innovation. Basically, we recognise that there is still so much that we don't know. We know a lot about the impacts of climate change on health and what we need to do about them, but there's so much that we don't know. And we have set ourselves a goal as the National Health Sustainability and Climate Unit of engaging with health research funding bodies to make the case for funding more research in this area. And I'm really keen to hear suggestions from the floor about where the biggest gaps lie. And I'm now going to go on to talk about some of the things that we care about, but already from some conversations I've already had since getting here, I've had new ideas about how we might pitch things and where we might describe the gaps as lying. So, as far as we can tell, the majority of climate and health research in this country it focuses on researching the health impacts of various climate hazards, extreme weather events in the epidemiological vein, kind of epidemiological type studies. And what there's much less of is studying interventions to ameliorate those impacts. So one thing that we've already been highlighting to research funding bodies is we need to fund interventional research, not just more of course, look, there's always more that you could know about the kind of the epidemiology of the impact of various climate hazards, because there are so many different climate hazards and so many different dimensions of health impact. But we think the bigger gap is in understanding the efficacy of the interventions that might be kind of undertaken to address those impacts. But as we were discussing earlier, after I got here, maybe that's kind of like going forward from the epidemiological studies. Maybe there's another gap which is going backwards to understanding the underlying physiological and metabolic processes that drive those health impacts. So thinking about what the metabolic impact of extremes of heat is on the human body. Maybe there's quite a lot that's still not understood there. We know that heat waves produce heat stress, heat stroke, hospitalizations, but what are the underlying physiological processes at work there? In general, we recognise that, in fact, so in terms of the work here for my team, there's two things. I already mentioned that we need to be and are engaged with research funding bodies to make the case for increased investment on climate and health. Primarily for us, that means engaging with the NHMRC and the MRFF, but also we're thinking about the wider pools of climate research funding that might be deployed to better understand the health impacts of climate change. So that's the first thing. But then the second thing is, actually a huge amount of my team's work day to day involves collaboration with academics. So for instance, we're currently in the process of finalising a report with University of Melbourne academics on how to detect and reduce leaks from piped nitrous oxide in hospitals, essentially. And so much of the work on climate and health is at that stage, which is generating the evidence base, disseminating the information about best practice, and ultimately you need to look to researchers, academics to produce that work, and then in a few years' time the work might be different. It might be actually kind of looking at harder levers to ensure uptake of what you need to do to reduce leaks from nitrous oxide. In terms of the practical things that we're engaged in, so we've been quite engaged both in supporting the NHMRC's targeted call for research on climate change and health, which closed last month. And also we're now engaged with the MRFF on the Global Health Initiative, which was announced in the budget as having climate change and health as one of its new research priorities. So that'll be $3 million per year over 10 years. In terms of what we think medical researchers have a role to play in, firstly, helping us to understand how to prevent and address the health impacts of climate change, and secondly, measuring and reducing emissions from medical research and its outputs. And so now I'm going to offer some feeble but hopefully somewhat useful thoughts on those topics for the rest of the lecture. So the first thing I wanted to do was talk about the centrality of prevention to all of our work in the National Health and Climate Strategy. I already talked about prevention as the cornerstone of of our health system decarbonisation efforts. It's also the cornerstone of our attempts to address the health impacts of climate change, because so many of those health impacts will take the form of exacerbation of pre-existing chronic conditions. So if you can prevent those chronic conditions from arising in the first place, or ensure that they're well managed, you're halfway there to tackling the health impacts. So, kind of research that we think is really would be really useful in supporting the prevention aspect of our work is looking at the risk, identifying and looking at the risk factors, addressing the risk factors for climate-sensitive chronic conditions, early detection and effective management, and also reducing the disease burden later in life. Okay, a couple of slides on communicable disease. We all know that climate change will increase the incidence and geographical spread of communicable disease and also create conditions favourable for the emergence of new diseases. We know that the climate-sensitive communicable diseases, there's a vast range of them: soil-borne, waterborne, foodborne, vector-borne, zoonoses, often which are also vector-borne. And we know that the risk from these impacts will shift as climate change increases in the years ahead. So, the kind of things that we think it would be great to know more about and have more research in is in climate-sensitive diseases that don't have effective vaccines available. Like Murray Valley encephalitis, I was fascinated to see the timeline down at WeHi and see mention of Murray Valley encephalitis more than a century ago. Still around, still doesn't have a vaccine. In terms of how to manage diseases that Australia doesn't have experience of managing at scale, and also diseases of potentially high transmissibility and severity. So the kinds of questions that we ask, that we kind of are always looking for evidence on in terms of thinking about how we contribute a climate lens to the wider policy within the Centre for Disease Control in terms of how we contribute a climate lens to the wider work within the CDC on communicable disease policy and response. How will climate change affect basically the survival and replication of key pathogens such as the dengue virus? How will it affect key vectors of infection such as various types of mosquito? How will it affect the incidence and prevalence of climate-sensitive communicable diseases? We're doing CSIRO is doing some great work on that as part of the National Climate Risk Assessment that we're engaged in. What will be the population health impacts of these, and what will be the impacts on the health system functioning? And then coming to the interventions, both vaccines, but also diagnoses, screening, and then treatments and therapies post-infection. Of the potential interventions, what is their efficacy? What is their acceptability? What is their scalability? So that's communicable disease. On non-communicable disease, you've probably all heard the statistic that 47% of Australians have a non-communicable disease. And I already mentioned that so many of those impacts of climate change will take the form of exacerbating existing chronic illnesses. So that means that many people with chronic illnesses are the people who are most vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change. Key areas of concern are respiratory disease, asthma, COPD, cardiovascular disease, heart failure, ischemic heart disease, and mental illness, both, direct trauma from exposure to climate-related disasters, but also wider climate anxiety. And there's an interesting debate about climate anxiety and whether it's a genuinely new presentation. So there's debate as to whether or not climate anxiety definitely exists. Is climate change increasing the overall prevalence of anxiety, or is it just something that people with pre-existing anxiety conditions have latched onto? And I know Origin, who's part of the Medical Research Institute's network, has done some really interesting survey-based work of young people suggesting that actually it is a genuinely new presentation and kind of increasing the overall stock of anxiety, especially amongst young people. So kind of some of the conditions, some of the questions, that we're always asking in terms of our engagement with our own chronic conditions division about how climate change is going to affect their work is, how will climate change affect all of the risk factors for various non-communicable diseases, the behavioural ones, the metabolic ones, as well as the environmental risk factors. How will climate change affect incidence, prevalence and outcomes for climate-sensitive NCDs? What will the impacts on health system demand, health system functioning be? What will be the profile of patients and how will it differ? And again, what's the efficacy and scalability and acceptability of the various interventions that can be thought of to address, that are out there to address the impacts of climate change on non-communicable disease. I just wanted to add another one that I thought of on the way here, which is developing new treatments that are for non-communicable disease that are suitable for use in extreme weather. So, one thing we know is that there are lots of medications, diuretics, antipsychotics, that are really bad to take during extremes of heat. Is it possible to develop treatments, alternatives to those treatments and other treatments that don't go well during extremes of weather extremes that are more suitable? Okay, so that's it on the health impacts. I've just got one slide on medical research and health system decarbonisation, and then one slide on the CDC, and then I'm done. So, the national strategy, as I mentioned, commits to achieving a net zero health system, and it also defines medical research as part of that health system. So, in terms of key challenges that come to my mind when thinking about the role of medical research in health system decarbonisation, firstly, reducing the emissions from medical research itself. It's been great to talk to some of the people from the Institute about what's being done there. In terms of how we measure and track those emissions, there is a little bit of a carbon accounting challenge, which is that I would assume that medical research institutes that are connected to universities, typically those emissions would be reported as part of the university. So therefore, where they appear in the national greenhouse accounts is against some industry code that's educational and not health service related. That's something we've got to figure out in the coming years, how exactly we measure them and incorporate them into our measures of overall health system emissions. But that's going to be a fun challenge. Secondly, when new treatments and interventions are being developed, embedding carbon footprinting and measuring the environmental impacts more broadly into that fundamental research so that then that can be reported on to commercialisation bodies and finally, when they come to approval by the TGA and so forth. And then supporting research to develop new low emissions treatments and interventions. So one that was mentioned to me was developing vaccines that are less reliant on cold chain storage. But I'm sure there are many other interesting examples. Related to all of this work is the work that I already mentioned, so I won't dwell on it, which is about thinking about the role of embedding reporting of environmental impacts in Australian health technology assessment processes. So, building that assessment of environmental impacts into all of the research that goes into generating the health technology products that we then go on to end use, is something that a great contribution that medical research can make. Okay, just an update on the Australian Centre for Disease Control. So my team operates within the interim Australian Centre for Disease Control, which was launched on the 1st of January 2024. As I'm sure most of you would know, this government is committed to establishing an Australian Centre for Disease Control. Right now, the interim Centre for Disease Control is operating within the Department of Health and Aged Care. But there are plans, I'm not sure exactly when, late this year, early next year, to bring forth legislation to make the Centre for Disease Control a statutorily independent organisation. As you may also know, there's a current inquiry underway into Australia's COVID-19 response. It's due to report at the end of September, and I think the government will have more to say on the future CDC after that report lands, and I can only assume that that's because the government wants to take account of the findings and recommendations of that inquiry in order to, finalise decisions about the scope and future role of the CDC. The thing I wanted to report to you is that although we're still operating within the department, the interim CDC is very much up and running. Certainly, our work continues apace to implement the National Health and Climate Strategy, but more broadly, a huge amount of new work is happening within the CDC on developing new monitoring and surveillance systems and strengthening, Australia's health emergency response and pandemic preparedness. Okay, so that's it from me, and I was hoping we could kind of, as well as taking questions from the floor, just take comments from the floor about what are the key priorities for medical research responding to challenges posed by climate change? How can governments better support medical research to respond to these challenges? And how can health policy and health planning make better use of the insights from medical research in designing their response to climate change? So I've spoken for longer than I hoped to, but I was really hoping to get ideas from the floor to flesh out our understanding of the role that medical research can play in all this. Thank you so much for listening to me speak, and thank you.
Thanks very much. Stay here. So while you're thinking of comments and questions, one thing, I was reflecting on who the Pope would be. You said the Pope was here in the audience. It's a difficult one. It's probably the chair of the Environmental Management and Sustainability Committee, and I just forgot to thank them very much for organising this event, because I think this is really going to be the most important health challenge of our future. I think the next 20 years and what climate change does. So it's a great timing for your talk. But please, comments and questions. And are you monitoring the online thing as well?
Yeah, got
two already. Okay. We'll start in the room. Alan.
Thanks very much. That was great, interesting. The Wellcome Trust, which is a big funder of medical research in the UK and internationally, including Australia, just released their policy of decarbonising the medical research that they fund, where they have set a whole heap of criteria that you have to comply with in order to get the funding to essentially bring the level of carbon release down in that medical research. Now, I presume National Health and Medical Research Council and Medical Research Future Fund would be thinking of something similar, at least now or sometime in the future. When you do that, that obviously comes with increased cost. And so making sure that if you enforce that, and the Wellcome Trust probably will give larger grants rather than the same level. NHMRC, I'm not sure they have enough money to be able to do that, and so that would be a worry going forward, that the requirement to comply with that sort of decarbonisation policy would not come with extra money, which I think would be an issue here.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you're certainly asking me about a policy that's kind of only a glimmer in people's eye in Australia. I have heard about those Wellcome Trust requirements, and I haven't looked at them, but they sound interesting and something that we should be thinking about. I mean, in terms of decarbonisation of medical research, it's worth just first making really clear that, our view is that improving patient health outcomes comes first. So that means that no research, no patient care or no patient beneficial research should be off the table just because it generates greenhouse gas emissions. But then there is a question about how the care is delivered, about how the research is undertaken, that might create opportunities for doing it in a less environmentally impactful way. I don't have more to say on that point about increased cost other than to acknowledge the general point. And a similar point indeed applies to the things that I was discussing about incorporating consideration of environmental impacts into cost effectiveness analysis, that obviously doing a carbon footprinting exercise for a new drug will be resource intensive. And then on the HTA side, everything in HTA, everything in cost-effective analysis needs to be independently checked and verified. So then there would be a resource impact of checking those carbon footprinting calculations. So there are resource implications of doing this, but ultimately my argument would be that this is the kind of work that needs to happen in order for us to get to a net zero world where we are no longer contributing to the problem that we all care so much about, which is the problem of climate change and the knock-on effects of health on human health. But yeah, many of those challenges lie ahead.
Sandra, and then we'll go online, perhaps.
Thanks for that great presentation. I guess two reflections. One is I think it'd be wonderful for the NHMRC and MRFF obviously to have an emphasis on climate change. We feel that the NHMRC has a pretty small envelope, and so the comments you made towards the end of that section of your talk about maybe leveraging other sources of funding, I'm sure would be welcome news to the researchers here who are struggling within an envelope that is pretty small by international standards. But the second point, with the MRFF global call that occurred some years ago, or maybe a year or two ago, so that was not really a global call. That was a call for research in Australia, and we couldn't actually see where the global fit into once you actually read the specifics. I think I'll just elaborate then. But I think when it comes to climate change in particular, Australia does punch above its weight in terms of emissions, but the impacts are felt equally around the world, and probably the people who are experiencing the health effects of climate change most are least responsible for the emissions that are causing them. And I think therefore there's some, if not moral imperative, to consider the health impacts outside this continent. I think there's also perhaps a strategic imperative in around the impacts of climate-based migration and all of that, which are probably political imperatives for the government. Anyway, just some thoughts.
Thank you. Yes, acknowledge that point about the Global Health Initiative. Ultimately, my understanding is that the MRFF is kind of established to support domestic research, so I would only assume that the global bit of the Global Health Initiative within the MRFF is about supporting domestic research on topics that are internationally relevant and in particular relevant to our region. Yes, and on that point about the wider, what was the second part of the question? Okay, great. Oh, I note your comment. Thank you. Yeah.
Got a couple from online. The first one is, what is the timeline for decarbonisation of the health sector?
Yeah, great question. So, as quickly as possible is the answer. We have committed to, we talk in the National Health and Climate Strategy about achieving a net zero health system in line with the overall commitment to a net zero Australia by 2050. But actually, I just want to separate out the net bit from the rest. So net zero means that you'll decarbonise what you can and then offset that through from negative emitting sectors of the economy or by buying international offsets. my assumption, given the way that Australia is set up institutionally, is that the health system, state health departments, Commonwealth Department of Health, is not going to be buying carbon credits. So really what we mean by a net zero health system is getting as close to actual zero as we can, and then participating in that national dialogue that will be happening, from 2035 onwards, about how we get from 94% emissions reductions to what we do about the remaining 6%. So we don't have a lot of thoughts about that, and that is a thought, the net zero bit is probably something for thinking about in 10 years' time, and probably not a discussion that needs to be happening within the health system in isolation. What we want to do is get to as close to zero as possible, as quickly as possible. And that's the work that we're undertaking as part of the National Health and Climate Strategy. We have a commitment within the National Health and Climate Strategy to publish a health system decarbonisation roadmap by 2025, and also as part of that to try to negotiate an emissions reduction trajectory with the states and territories, ideally in alignment with that, although we don't say that in the strategy because it may be a hard thing to land. Now, actually, what that does, in terms of negotiating a health system emissions reduction trajectory with states and territories, what that doesn't acknowledge is that in Australia there are lots of actors, actually private healthcare private insurance that wouldn't be part of such a negotiated trajectory. So we also need to think about how to bring the private component of the health system into that. But we're very lucky that actually many of the biggest private health insurers and private healthcare providers in this country, actually Bupa and Ramsay, etc., HealthScope, have very strong commitments to achieving net zero amongst themselves as part of their wider corporate social responsibility commitments. So that's a vague answer, but just to say the bit that I'm focused on is not the net zero bit, but just getting as close to zero as we can as quickly as possible.
Another one?
Yep. Are suppliers of medical consumables transitioning away from the widespread use of single-use plastics and packaging to reduce this huge petrochemical footprint?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we have a whole stream of work at the moment as part of implementing our strategy on basically developing a taxonomy for all the different waste reduction opportunities that exist in relation to healthcare delivery, and then developing a taxonomy of them and developing where the biggest bang for buck lies in terms of emissions reduction, because there are so many different waste reduction initiatives you could be undertaking. I think that single-use medical consumables is emerging as a high priority, and one of the key challenges that we're facing here is the classification of things as single-use. What our research and kind of stakeholder engagement has highlighted is that a lot of things are labelled as single-use when they actually could be reused. And right now, my understanding, don't shoot me if this is wrong, is that, TGA rules actually prohibit the reprocessing and reuse of things that are labelled single-use by the manufacturer. So there's a couple of things that we think need to change there. So N95 masks. You wouldn't want to use someone else's N95 mask, but I've been told that, you could use it for one patient, put it in a steriliser, and then reuse it yourself perfectly well. So yeah, I think there are lots of opportunities there, and it's about developing the kind of processes within care delivery to allow for reprocessing, but also maybe looking at the regulatory environment and whether there are any barriers. I mentioned TGA, but also infection prevention and control policies that might be a barrier to sensible reprocessing and reuse of consumables and other things.
Thanks, Madeleine. I've got one comment. Which we discussed earlier, which is that one of the gaps, I think, in the approach that we're taking to understanding the impact of climate change is the fact that we have almost no information on the impact on fundamental human biology of increased ambient temperature for a sustained period of time. And we also don't know almost nothing about what happens to the mouse under the same circumstance. And it's quite clear that our physiology is disrupted by increased ambient temperature. We don't know what to measure, we don't know what the impact is. And I think there's a lot for WEHI to think about its fundamental biology efforts. Just, should we be working in this space to understand how ambient temperature and climate change impact human health and impact human biology? So just a thought, because funding doesn't appear to be coming is not forthcoming for that sort of fundamental research, but I think until we have that, we won't know what to measure. We don't really know the difference between discomfort caused, when does discomfort caused by heat stop and health detriment start? We don't know that. We just know we feel a bit uncomfortable in the summer. So lots to learn, I think, from our perspective as well as from a more policy-driven perspective. And Madeleine, thank you very much for introducing the latter. Are there any more final questions? Do you want to say any final words?
Oh, I had a final question.
Oh.
So it seems like knowing the embedded carbon cost in drugs and plastic or whatever would be really useful for everybody. So is there any push by other departments to be able, for a consumer, to be able to understand the carbon, the carbon cost of each product that they buy, the embedded carbon?
Yeah, a great question. So our Commonwealth Department of Climate Change recently released an environmentally sustainable procurement policy that applies to all Commonwealth government agencies. It doesn't have much impact on health because most of the buying in health happens at state and territory level. I don't think that policy does include specific requirements for measuring and reporting the embodied emissions at product level. I think that the sequencing of how these things tend to work is that firstly you need to get the organisations to measure their emissions, report on them, develop emissions reduction plans, and then only once that's happening can you move to the much harder task of product level carbon footprinting. And I think that's the direction the world needs to go in, but it's just worth naming that we're going to need to train a whole industry of people to do life cycle analysis, to do carbon footprinting. But that's doable because I think in the early 90s, many countries in the world trained a whole workforce to do cost effectiveness analysis to inform, decisions by the PBS, decisions by NICE. That was a workforce that was created because of a recognised regulatory need, and I think we can do the same in relation to carbon footprinting, but it's going to be a big piece of work. And absolutely, it's not just health technology products. The NHS England is embodying carbon footprinting requirements in relation to all of their procurement, but they're not introducing those requirements until like 2027, 2028, just because you need to get the standards for carbon footprinting right, and then you need to actually have the workforce to do it.
It's an interesting thought, though. It's potentially very powerful beyond healthcare as well. I mean, at the moment, when you get your steak in the supermarket, you can look at the colour code and see how much fat and sugar it has in it. You can also see what its carbon footprint was and take that into account when making decisions. But presumably very tough to calculate and very easy to gain by the supermarkets. But that's another issue. So Madeleine, thank you very much. If there's nothing else online, I'd like to thank you for your talk, and please keep in touch with our committee and with the rest of us as things go forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak.